Sure. I mean, I'd like to be done. I'd like to be done by 11 if that's possible.
Okay, cool. No problem. We're done. We're recording.
Hello. Good morning.
How are you doing, mate?
I'm very well, thank you. Very well.
You're looking well, I gotta say. Are you on some kind of crazy regimen?
Well, I tell you what. uh, Coming out of the lockdown, I reached, and this will probably give us a good in for this conversation. I reached 90 kilos, and I'm
Okay.
5'9".
Yes.
And so already I'm mixing my measures. But and so and I was fasting. I took up fasting, and I've just been consistently fasting, doing the 5-2 diet for a couple of years now, and I've lost 18, 19 kilos. And I've gone from 90, I'm now 71, 72 kilos. And I'm also very fit. I I I run, I stretch a bit, I do weights, I cycle, and it's sort of partly accidental. My girlfriend, who is no longer my girlfriend, but she was 36 and I'm 54, 35 and I'm 54. And I think probably having a younger girlfriend forces you to get into shape as well. And but yeah, so like I played football last night, and I play with a lot of guys who are in their 30s, and I was easily covering as much ground, if not more ground. You know, I was every bit as fit as them. So yeah, I've worked hard at it, but I'm in good shape. 19 kilos I've lost.
Well done, mate. Excellent. And yes, you did hint to what we're going to talk about today: measures, weights and measures, and all of
Yeah.
that good stuff. So that is going to be Lauren's first question.
What is a matrix system?
Metric.
Metric.
Yeah.
Metric.
So the metric system is the system by which uh, almost all of the world uses to measure weight and to measure distance. So things like meters and centimeters and kilometers are metric. And before metric, people used miles and inches, which are called imperial measures or English measures. And metric weights would be kilos and grams, whereas traditional weights would be pounds and ounces and things like that. And the metric system was invented by the French shortly after the French Revolution in 1789. But now every country in the world uses the metric system, at least nominally. In practice, they use traditional weights and measures, but nominally they use the metric system. And the only countries with strong enough national cultures to withstand metric are America, the United States of America, Myanmar, and Liberia.
Wow.
So there we go. But apart from those three countries, everyone uses meters and kilograms and liters. When you do your weights and measures, do you think in meters and kilometers, or do you think in miles?
Kilometers and meters.
And when you do
And
your
when,
baking, what are you measuring in?
Grams.
yeah, so you use the metric system.
Whereas
But
if you were to come to the butcher's with granddad, when we go back and visit Nanny and granddad, if you come into the butcher with me and granddad, he would say, "Oh, could I have 2.5 pound of ham, please?" And I'll be standing there scratching my head, and the butcher knows exactly what to do. I'm like, "What the hell's going on? Like 2.5 pounds isn't going to buy much meat," because my mind is like, "Oh." But of course, it's not pounds as in the money, it's 2.5 pounds as in the weight, which would be just over a kilo.
do you think in metric, Daniel?
I do,
Or
mate. Yes, I do now.
and how old are you?
47.
Okay, so I'm 54, and they were just bringing in metric. I was taught metric at school, and my father would joke about the fact that he thought in inches and I thought in centimeters. And um, yeah, I mean, metric, my kid thinks in metric as well, my kids do. But actually, the traditional weights and measure system, as we shall discover, is so much more intuitive. It's just so much better.
So you mentioned the countries that had held fast. I mean, England, do you say, has fallen, even though we're still using miles per hour?
Well, unfortunately, every country that adopted the metric system did so after some kind of political turmoil, usually some kind of revolution. And what I think the only one that didn't was Japan, and Britain is the other exception. And we only adopted, we're just totally hypocritical in Britain. We half do metric and we half do imperial. And the reason it was called imperial, it's called imperial, is it wasn't called anything. In fact, let's just backpedal 1 second. The most important thing to understand about traditional weights and measures is that it is not a system. Okay, metric is a designed system, and it's a very simple system, all based around the number 10. And the decimalization as a form of mathematics started to take hold in the 18th century. And decimalization is a very easy way to think because we have 10 fingers. We think in decimals. It's just a very intuitive way to think. And so decimalization began to take hold. And we'll come to the invention of metric, but metric itself was invented in the aftermath of the French Revolution. And every country that's adopted it since has done so after some kind of political turmoil. And what happens is the new regime likes to impose a new system of weights and measures because it's a way of changing the past and getting rid of the past. But metric, as I say, it is a designed system, whereas imperial, I'll call it imperial for a second, it was only called imperial in about 1815. And this was because of the rise of metric. And the English suddenly felt the need to defend their system. So they called it imperial and sort of exported it out through the empire. And Americans, who also use the same system, don't call it imperial because America had parted with Britain in 1780, whatever it was. And so they'd already left the empire. So they actually call it English weights and measures because the colonialists had brought it over with them. But the point I'm coming to is traditional weights and measures are not a system. They are a process. It's not a planned system. They've just emerged over time through use. So it's very much a free market outcome, and they change over time as needs change. So, for example, a furlong was the distance that an acre was the distance that 4 cattle could plough in a day. So a plough with some oxen pulling it, and that was an acre. So it's a very obvious measure. That's how much a cow can plough in a day. And a furlong was the distance that a plough would walk, the cow would walk before you'd turn it round. And a furlong happens to be about 200 meters. It's also the distance that a man of average fitness can sprint for before he has to stop. 200 meters. And it's just a really kind of intuitive distance. But we don't talk in furlongs anymore because we don't use cows and oxen to plow our fields. We use tractors. So furlong is a measure, and you still see it in things like horse racing and so on. And so, but that's an example of how, because of the needs of people over time, a measure has sort of been abandoned and moved on. So as I say, imperial is just an ongoing process, or traditional weights and measures are an ongoing process, whereas metric is fixed and planned and designed. So right at the heart of it, you have the difference between the technocrat who likes to impose a system and a free market process.
Grassroots, bottom up, what we're seeing with Bitcoin and the adoption of money, which we're going to make so many direct analogies to.
It's exactly the same.
Hmm.
And what you're actually finding is that all traditional measures are based around the human body in some way, because before people had rulers and scales and electric scales, we've had scales since forever, but electric scales, before we had rulers, most people didn't have, a ruler on their person or a tape measure. So you had to make do with the most immediate thing you had to hand, which was the human body. And so we used the human body to measure things. So a foot, for example, is quite literally a foot. It is a size 10 shoe with a boot on. And that's a very quick way of measuring distance on the ground. You just stick your foot down and you've got a foot. And there's 3 feet make a yard. And a yard happens to be a pace. and a yard is also the distance to the waist of most people. And people always carried, farmers. And if you look at pictures of farmers all around the world, doesn't matter if they're in Africa or in South America or in Europe, wherever, you often see them with what's called a yardstick. And the yardstick, would be used for beating off unwanted animals or whatever, or moving the cows along. But it's also very quick way for measurement. And a human is actually, the average human, typical human, would be 2 yards in height, 6 feet. And a yard, if you took the distance from my solar plexus here to the end of my fingertips, that would be a yard as well. So it's just, they're all around. And then if I do that, that would be a fathom, which is 2 yards, 6 feet. And a fathom was a really useful measure. We used fathoms to measure depth. And it was a really useful measure because you had your rope. If you were a sailor, you had your rope, and you measured the rope distance like that, and then you could drop the rope with a weight on into the sea, and then you held the distance, you pulled it out, and then you measured the distance of the rope with your arms, and you had a very quick measure of depth. And so that's why we use fathoms, and as I say, 6 foot. And they all intertwine with each other. So, for example, you wouldn't use a foot. We do now, but originally you wouldn't. If you were measuring an animal, the height of an animal, for example, you wouldn't use a foot, because feet is for measuring distance on the ground. You can't measure upwards with your feet. So you would use your hand. And if you were measuring, so if you're looking at me, you would measure an animal and you'd go like that, and you'd measure the height of an animal. So that's why the height of a horse or whatever is measured in hands. Now, a hand is 4 inches. The width of a hand is 4 inches. And so there'd be 3 hands to a foot, and then 3 foot to a yard. But if you do that with your hands and you open them up, that would be a span, and a span is 6 inches. And even though human beings are different sizes, there's an incredible consistency with these measures. So you can look at, for example, a foot from, the ancient world, and compare it to a Russian foot, and compare it to an American foot, and to an English foot. And they're all really, really similar. And there's just an amazing consistency. And so a span, anyway, is the same as a foot, a hand and a span. And then you go to an inch, and the word for inch and thumb is interchangeable in a gazillion different languages around the world. And an inch is quite literally a thumb. And that's what you'd use for measuring small distances, a thumb. And so you have 4 thumbs make a hand, 6 thumbs make a span, or 6 thumbs and 6 inches. And then, sorry, I said a span was a foot. A span is half a foot. And then 2 spans, 12 inches, is a foot. And so they all link to each other. Now, if you try and explain this as a planned system, it makes no sense, because, it just makes no sense as a system, but it's actually totally organic and natural, because it's all based around the human body. And the problem with, and it's the same with weights, by the way, as well. Today, a pound is exactly the same as a Babylonian mina. The mina was the weight they used in ancient Babylon. And it's basically just a handful. Like if I told you to hold as many apples as you can hold in your hand, and then you took those 3 or 4 apples and you put them on some scales, it would be a pound. A pound is just a handful. And it's a really useful measure for obvious reasons. A pound is a handful. And then you go from there, and we'll go into micro measurements. Now, obviously, you can't use the human body to design to go much smaller than an inch. I suppose you could have the little finger or something. But so what they used to do is they would use seeds, barley seeds, wheat seeds. And if you look at like Magna Carta, which is the old English document, famous English document, they argue about how many seeds there are, the measures of seeds. But if you take a barley corn, I might even have some. Oh, it'll take me a second to find them. But if you take a barley corn, there are 3 barley corn. Barley corns are remarkably consistent in size and weight. And there are 3 barley corns to an inch. And we used seeds to measure small things. For example, precious metals, we used to measure in seeds. Carrot seeds, we use the seeds of the carrot tree. And that's where we get the word carrots for when we measure precious metals. But there are 3 barley corns to an inch. And if you've ever wondered, for example, about your shoe size, how do they measure shoe sizes? Why is it size 8, size 9? Well, the difference between a size 8 and a size 9 is 1 barley corn, a third of an inch. And so shoe sizes are measured in inches. But even metric shoe sizes, they're each metric shoe size, 41, 42, whatever it is, it's like 0.2 millimeters or whatever it is. But actually, it's just a barley corn. So even though they use the metric denomination, they're actually using the distance that is a barley corn. And this is what you're finding with the metric system, is that even though it's called centimeters or meters or whatever, more and more people, the most commonly used measures are the old traditional measures. So, for example, 30 centimeters is a really common measurement, and we have rulers that are 30 centimeters, but 30 centimeters is just a foot. And similarly, shoe sizes are measured in a barley corn. And you'll also find, like, I was with my son the other day, and I was just testing him out. Well, the other day, it was a year ago when I did this lecture. And I said, tell me what the width of the sink is. And he said, I'm going to guess 45 centimeters. And I said, why did you guess that? And he said, well, I thought of a ruler, and it was like a ruler and a half. So I said 45 centimeters. And now, interestingly, 45 centimeters is a cubit, the distance from the elbow to the end of the finger, 45 centimeters. And that's a cubit. And the cubit is the foundational measure of the pyramids. And again, it's a really useful measure because you can take a rope and you can wrap the rope like a sound man does with the technical wire. You wrap the rope around your thing, and you tie a knot in each bit of the rope, and you have the cubit. So the cubit was actually the distance. The ancient Egyptian cubit was the distance from the pharaoh's elbow to the end of his fingertips, and then everyone else had to follow what the pharaoh did. And that's why weights and measures have often changed over the years, because the king would say a yard is the distance from my chest to the end of my fingers. And of course, you'd have a different king who'd be slightly different size, and so the measure of the yard would change. But there's actually a beauty to this, because you would have, a French foot would be slightly different to an English foot, for example, because it was derived from the king, the pied du roi, they called it in France. And so it means that the buildings based around the foot in a village in France are different to the buildings based around a foot in a village in England, because they're using a slightly different foot. And so as a result, you get diversity in architecture. Whereas now, because everyone just uses meters and they use the same concrete materials, buildings are the same the world over. There's no regional diversity because the measures are the same. So there's an intuitive, so traditional measures are intuitive and there's a beauty to them. And the reason there's a beauty to them is that they're all derived around the human body. And the human body is proportionate in the eyes of other humans. We are biologically programmed to find the human body attractive, the proportions of the human body. And if you look at, an ancient Greek statue of a warrior or a beautiful princess or something, it's the beauty is in the proportion. And there is an inbuilt proportion to traditional weights and measures, which is why you can look at old buildings and you might look at an old warehouse or an old, a building that wasn't designed to be beautiful, an old warehouse or an old barn or something. And you go, why is that beautiful? It's just beautiful. And it's because the proportion is inherent to it. Whereas you look at modern buildings, there's no inherent proportion to metric. So unless the architect has deliberately planned to have proportion based around the human body, the building will inevitably not be proportionate, or it will only be proportionate by accident in a way that is attractive to human beings. Now, you can go one stage further and say that I explained it, we're biologically programmed to find the human body attractive. There's another angle to this where the religious will say that God made man in his own image, and therefore the human body is divine, and therefore traditional weights and measures are based around God's image, and therefore they are divine. And so, you can take that argument, and it's a strong argument. So I'll tell you about the history of metric in a second. So that's why traditional measures are good, because they're beautiful and they've happened over time organically through the needs of human beings. Now, what I was saying, like the meter is very close to a yard. So that's kind of an all right measurement. It's a bit long, really. But you find that more and more people, so for example, the half kilo is a really common measure, particularly for food. And that's, again, that's just what you can hold in your hand comfortably. And you will also find 200 grams, which would be the half pound, basically, is a really common measure. And you just find the old traditional weights and measures creeping back into the metric system just by a different name. So, go on, I've spoken for ages, so you say something.
Yeah, I got loads to go on here. But first of all, Lauren, did you have any follow-up questions, or are you going to run upstairs?
I don't think I have any follow-up questions, but that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, you got lots to go and think about.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dom, for the history lesson on weights and measures. That's been her history today, homeschooling.
Yeah.
Oh, good stuff. If you look at a brick, when you see a brick, Laurent, a brick is always a hand's width, 4 inches, for obvious reasons. So a brickie could pick up the brick. And you look at bricks; they're kind of the same the world over, but they're always based. The brick is the building block of everything, and a brick is a hand.
Perfect.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye. See you. I don't know when.
Bye, Laurent.
Bye.
So yeah, mate. I know it was because she does horse riding, and so when you were talking about the hands, the height of the horse, so I could see her brain, working, because what is it? 14 hands is that anything above 14 hands is the difference between a pony and a horse.
I didn't know that, but that sounds about right.
Yeah, something like that. And then the other thing, fathoms. I'm so glad you went to fathoms, because I was dying to ask you about that. And the sailors tying the knot in and dropping it down, because leagues is another measure we never hear anymore.
A league is basically 3 miles, and it's the distance a man can walk in an hour.
Why was that used as a depth measurement? Or am I wrong?
I don't know. I mean, because you're thinking of like 30,000 leagues under the sea.
Exactly, yeah.
Or how many leagues was it under the sea? It was more
so
a measure
many
of,
you were through the other end of the planet, I think. It was
yeah. I think to be honest, I don't think they did measure depth in leagues. I
Right.
think the potency of that title is the fact that she's talking about depth in terms of leagues. You would measure distance in leagues.
So
You know,
you
distance
said
that
there
you
was
walk.
3 miles.
3 miles is what you walk in an hour. It's an hour's walk.
So there's that number 3 again. Like, you know,
Yeah.
it's 3 centimeters to an inch, and on we go up the scales. Okay, so
And a mile originally, miles have changed, but the mile originally meant 1,000 paces. The Roman mile was 1,000 paces. Mile, it's the same word.
yeah,
But it wasn't, it was, if you think when you're marching, you'll hear the soldiers go left, 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 right, left, left, left. And so a pace, a Roman pace, was actually 2 paces. It was the left, right, left. And 2 paces is 5 foot. 1 pace is 3 foot, but 2 paces is 3 foot, is 5 foot, because you lose the pace in the crossover. So a mile was originally 1,000 paces, or 1,005 feet. So it was 5,000 feet. And then it got changed. There was all sorts of, I forget why the English changed it. And the Scottish mile is different to the English mile, but it was to the Roman mile. We changed. There was some reason why we changed it. I've forgotten what it is, but I did know that once upon a time.
and now it's called the 1,500 meters, right? If you're watching the Olympics.
Yeah, well, I think a mile is about 1,700 or 1,800 meters, but 1,500 meters is the metric mile, they call it.
Yeah, which yeah. So what took you down this rabbit hole? Because I was listening to you on the James Delingpole podcast, and I was loving it, by the way. And I was like, God, we've got to do a rip on this and tie it all into Bitcoin, because we're redefining weights and measures, like we're going back to basics almost. An emergent property. Human beings are converging on a new form of money, a new form of measuring value. And they're all tied into what you were talking about with James, but you didn't manage to get onto that. I don't think he likes talking about Bitcoin on his show. So that's why I wanted you to come on.
James likes Bitcoin.
That's good to know.
Yeah. Just wait one second. What was his name? I'm just trying to remember the name of. Okay, so what this was is sorry, I've lost the page. Oh God, there we go. I've lost my Zoom thing. Here we go. So I wrote an essay for the Idler magazine back in 2007, 2008 called How Heavy? Called Why Gold is the Currency of the Free. And it was all about sound money and why we need gold and blah, blah, blah. And in the book that essay was published in, there was another essay all about weights and measures and how intuitive traditional weights are. And it was just absolutely brilliant essay. And I just loved reading. It was only 2 pages long and it just stuck in my head. And each year at the Edinburgh Festival, I like to go up and do a lecture about a subject that interests me. And I usually write the show very quickly, just in a few days. And so one year I did a show about the history of the Edinburgh Festival. And I just thought it would be really interesting to do a lecture about the history of weights and measures and how, and because it's fun, because you can get the audience up and measure things and have them pacing around. And so I just did it as a lecture at the Edinburgh Festival one year. And it was one of those things. It just became a subject. I plan to write a book about it at some stage. Warwick, what was his name who wrote that essay? Warwick, I've forgotten his surname. But anyway, it just really, really stuck with me. And, it's weights and measures are how you define the world and how you see things. And so that's kind of a really important foundational subject, almost like money. It's just a foundational thing. And few people ever question it. And what really gets my goat is on the internet, you'll go, oh, look, so-and-so's championing traditional measures, and they'll get a graphic off Wikipedia that shows the metric system, and then it shows the imperial system. And the imperial system is so higgledy-piggledy and nonsensical, and it just looks stupid if you look at it through the eyes of a planned system. It makes no sense. But if you look at it organically, as I've explained, around the human body, and realize that it's not a system, it's a process, then it makes much more sense.
And that's why, like, as you said to Lauren, why we've lost so much, beauty in our towns and villages. Where we live in France right now, I'm on the edge of a medieval town, and you walk in and it's just incredible. It's beautiful, like unbelievable.
Yeah.
The materials that they were using, and the fact that no building looks the same, and half of them are crooked and whatever else. Whereas you walk around like Milton Keynes, and you're going to be like, oh, or any British high street, to be honest, right now, they're all just like square, blocky, crappy looking like units.
Yeah, it's horrible. And the here's the thing. The metric system is built on a fraud. Okay.
All right. Okay, I like it.
And so what happened is, okay, there is a very strong argument to have a universal system of weights and measures, because, especially in science, because if everyone's talking in different weights and measures, it's like you have to translate the language the whole time, in the same way that there's an argument for a universal language. And you can't, much as people try, you can't plan language. It's just a constantly evolving thing. And people try and regulate, you can't use this word and blah, 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 but it's still an organic, ongoing process. And that's what weights and measures were like. But so there's a famous story about they were filling up a plane in Canada, and the airline, or whoever it was responsible for filling up the plane with fuel, thought that they were given the measure, and they thought they were using pounds and whatever, and they were actually using kilos. So they didn't fill the plane up with enough fuel, and then the plane ended up running out of fuel mid-flight and crashing. And there's another story where there was a fire in Baltimore, and they had to get the fire engines. This is at the turn of the 20th century, and they had to get the fire engines in from all the cities around Baltimore. And they all got to Baltimore from New York and Washington or wherever, but none of the fire engines could attach their hoses to put out the fire in Baltimore, because they used different valves. In each of the different cities had a different valve rather than using the same valve. And so they just watched as Baltimore burnt to the ground. So there is a reason why, you need one measure for everything. But especially in the days before the digital economy, when everything was physical, rulers were, every time there's a new ruler, you see him trying to impose a standardized system of weights and measures. And this was always just for the purposes of taxation, so that, you could tax people more easily. And in France, in the lead up to the revolution, the system of weights and measures had just become totally corrupted. There would literally be a different pound for each village that you came to, and everywhere had their different pounds, and all the tax collectors were using different weights and measures, and it was chaos. It was mayhem. And people were using the inconsistencies between the measures to collect more taxes and rip people off, and it was just chaos. So they wanted, and what the French revolutionaries wanted, is, instead of designing a system of weights of measures around the human body, they were going to design a universal system of weights and measures for all time, instead of around the human body, around the earth itself. Okay. And this would be just so much bigger and more special. So they sent two scientists out, and they were going to measure the distance from the North Pole down to the equator. They were going to measure that distance. And they set these two scientists out, but instead of doing it from the North Pole to the equator, they decided to do it from Dunkirk to Barcelona. And then they would extrapolate it up from there.
I was going to say, yeah, what year was this? Yeah, you guys just trod off to the North Pole.
1790 something.
Right, okay. Nonsense.
And so they sent these two scientists out from France, from Paris, and one guy went north to Dunkirk and the other guy went to Barcelona. And they were using those, are they called sextants? Those things where you're the triangular system of measures where you would, so that way you could, and they would take the top of one building to the top of a hill and do the triangulation and so on. But the guy who went to Paris, from Paris to Barcelona, he just had an absolute nightmare. Like at one stage, they thought he was a tax collector because he was doing this measuring thing. So they arrested him and threw him in jail. He had all his money taken off him. He got mugged. And then at another point, they thought he was a witch and they chased him out of town, and he had an absolute nightmare. So he didn't collate the data properly. And so he just guessed it. He just guessed what it was going to be. And they took the data, and it only emerged about 5 years later that the data he submitted was just wrong, was just made up. And they took the measure from the equator to the North Pole. And in the end, I think they were out by about 2 kilometers, something like that. So it was pretty close.
Not bad.
But it was wrong.
Right.
And then the meter was going to be 1/10,000,000th of that. So by the time or maybe it was 1/1,000,000th, I can't remember. I'm sorry. It's so long since I did the lecture. Some of the facts have lost me. So that each individual meter is only out by a few millimeters, but it's still out. And so the fundamental measure of this new system is flawed. And then at later times, they decided to, and then that was it. Then they got the official meter and they made it out of platinum so that, it didn't change its shape because, platinum is a heavy metal and doesn't corrode or any of that stuff. And they stuck the official meter in somewhere in Paris, important building in Paris. But then somebody stole the platinum. Somebody melted it down and replaced the platinum with some other heavy metal and nicked the platinum. So the official thing changed size. The official measure changed size. By only a tiny amount, but it changed size. But if you're like, we're building this system around the world and it has to be perfect and all the rest of it. So originally it was flawed and then the thing changed. So this went on, and Napoleon imposed this new measure, and the French just wouldn't use it. You got arrested if you didn't use the new measures. And then by the time Napoleon was writing his memoirs, he just hated it. He was and he said they would not rest. And so the French abandoned it. But the Belgians kept it. Everything that's wrong in the world starts in Belgium. And the Belgians
sorry, Belgian listeners.
the European Union, the Belgians had their own revolution. The Belgians kept it, and then the Dutch followed. And then the French had another revolution in 1830 or 1840, and then they adopted it. And gradually it just spread. Because there was a lot of political turmoil, the freeing of South America, a lot of revolutions in South America over the course of the 19th century, and they gradually adopted it. And then they standardized the meter quite recently. Instead of basing it around the distance, this flawed distance to the thing, they based it around the speed of light, how much distance a light can travel. But it's like most fantastically precise measurement, but it's totally incomprehensible. And because what they were doing is the speed of light, but they were keeping the original meter. Do you see what I mean?
Right.
But so they found a way of measuring the speed of light to this meter, and that's how they define the meter. So now the meter is much more consistent, but it's still just like, why are you measuring that? It doesn't mean anything. But the beauty of the decimal system is it's just such a simple system around the number 10. And you can extrapolate it up and you can extrapolate it down for nanoscience or macro science. So it does have a function and a purpose from that point of view. But I have to get the numbers up. But I think if you actually measure the speed of light, let me get the number. Somebody came up and told me after one of the lectures that the speed of light is let's see if I can find it. Yeah. So they redefined the meter and it was 1,650,763.74 wavelengths in a vacuum of an orange red ray of krypton 86 atom. I mean, what the fuck? Why is that a meter? And then they used it, redefined it in 1983 using atomic clocks. And it was the distance traveled by light in a vacuum in 1 over 299,792, sorry, 299,792,458 seconds. So, I mean, it's just like, what? So it's fantastically imprecise, but each redefinition preserved the length of that original 1799 meter, the original flawed meter. So one of the there's a guy called Ken Alder who wrote a history of the metric system, and he called it an error for all people for all time. But if you actually look at the speed of light, it travels at 1 foot per nanosecond.
Oh
so,
my God.
You know, so it's actually one of those bizarre coincidences. Now, here's the other thing. When the French imposed the metric system of measurement, they also tried to impose metric time.
Right.
And so let me find out what the measurements of metric time are. So it was 1 day was 10 hours, and 1 hour was 100 minutes, and 1 minute was 100 seconds. And 1 week was 10 days. And the reason the French weren't having it, why they rose up and stopped it. So the French actually had metric time from 1794 to 1806. But the reason they stopped it.
But they were going by that metric time for those years,
yeah.
like over a decade.
Yeah.
No way.
Like at the top level, nobody did it on the ground, but at the top level. But the reason they rose up and rebelled, it's so funny. The reason they abandoned it is because a week was 10 days. It meant they only got 1 day off every 10 days instead of 1 day off a week. And so they were like, I'm not having that. We want 1 day off a week, not 1 day off every 10 days. And that's why it didn't get through. So lazy French.
Or sensible French for standing up for themselves. So yeah, just a few things here then. So the word ruler, I've never understood ever since I was at school why that thing was called a ruler, like 30 centimeters. You know, like, why is it called a ruler? But now it's just clicked because you said each time a new ruler came in, that yard would, that measurement would slightly change. And that would be the new ruler. So I'm guessing that's why when we had the metric system, that 30 centimeters became the new ruler.
It never even occurred to me that, but as soon as you say it, it seems obvious.
Right. Absolutely.
I didn't even know. Yeah.
Okay, good. Now,
and there's some more things, like the liter,
right,
is also in an inaccurate measure, and it's so much so that whoever the official body of measures around the world are, they've now abandoned the liter. It's no longer an official measure because it's flawed. It's based on the whole thing is flawed. And here's quite an interesting thing: a pint was originally.
I knew you'd go to a pint. Thank you. You're a good British man.
A pint was originally a pound of water. That's what a pint was, a pound of water. A pint is a pound the whole world round. That's what it was. And then when the English were trying to defend their pints with against the onslaught of metric, so a pint would be 16 ounces. And it's like enough to quench your thirst. Now, I obviously
and as
love.
well, back to your other point, it's enough to comfortably hold in your hand, right? That if you hold
Yeah,
it, right?
exactly. But have you ever thought when you drink an English pint, you have a pint of beer, have you ever thought, actually, that's quite a lot? That's
Yes.
probably a little bit more than I need.
Yes.
Um, so a pint was originally a pound of liquid, 16 ounces, and that's what an American pound is. But to compete with continental metric, instead of uh, there would be 8 pints to a gallon. And the reason, by the way, that weights would be 16, 8, 4, 2 for measures is because they're divisible. So you would cut, like if you had a piece of cake, you imagine a piece of cake and you cut it in two, and you like if you would divide a piece of cake into 10, it's actually quite hard. But if you cut it in half, then you cut it in half again, and then you cut it in half again, and then you cut it in half again, you end up with 16. So that's why there's you have 16 ounces to the pound. It's practical divisibility. But anyway, as I say, a pound was originally 16 ounces of liquid, but and a gallon was 8 pints. But because the English at some point decided they were competing with the French and they were scared of this metric, they decided that a gallon should be 10 pounds of water instead of 8 pounds of water. But there would still be 8 pints to the gallon. So the result was that they had to increase the size of the pint, I should say. So the English pint grew by 4 ounces. It grew by a quarter. And that's why the English pint is bigger than the American pint, and why the English pint is a bit big. So it's actually, the English pint is 20 ounces, when really a pint should be 16 ounces. And that's the expression, is a pint of water weighs a pound and a quarter. So that's one of those things, but I guess, and it just stuck. And by the way, what's the smaller measure, smaller than a pint? It's just a mouthful. And there's 3 mouthfuls to an old pint. It's amazing. And if you try and drink more, you just can't. It's a mouthful was a mouthful is a shot,
right?
Or is it 2 shots? I can't remember. But it's just again, it's a really practical measure. And here's the thing: they're all designed around the human body, and I remember at the Bitcoin conference in March in Miami last year, going to Michael Saylor had a dinner at his house. And I went to this dinner and I sat next to some dude, I've forgotten his name, and he had a YouTube channel. And whenever you have a few drinks and you're at a Bitcoin dinner, you start going, the conversation inevitably comes up, who do you think Satoshi Nakamoto is?
Right.
And, I spent ages on that subject when I wrote my book. And I kind of regret it now because, I thought it was Nick Szabo and I probably caused him a lot of misery. Everyone thinks it was Nick Szabo and the poor guy has been anyway, we were having this conversation. I was having this conversation. Who do you think Satoshi is? And I've heard so many arguments. Like Matonis, by the way, used to swear that Craig Wright showed him the keys. And anyway, but he somehow got defrauded. But anyway, and whether it was this guy Dave Kleiman in Florida or Nick Szabo, whoever, it always comes up. And you start talking, and then somebody goes, "Oh, I think it was Hal Finney," and you go, "Yeah, but the writing stars don't quite match up." And then I think it was this dude in Australia, and I think it was Elon Musk, and I think it was the CEO. And then the guy I was sitting to next to dinner just turned to me, and he went, "Well, maybe aliens put it here to give human beings a chance of saving themselves, or maybe God put it there to give human beings a chance of saving themselves." And I kind of went, "What?" And obviously I'd never even countenanced that thought or that idea for a second. And then I started processing it, and I thought, do you know what? That's one of the most credible explanations that I've heard beyond Nick Szabo. Like, because no human being in the world had that knowledge that Satoshi had at the intersection of all those things. So I was thinking, so maybe if aliens or God put it there, and it's a bit like Weights and Measures being divine in God's image. And yeah, that conversation just stuck with me.
Interesting. I'd love to know who that was. I have heard
I have
those
to look
theories
up his
before.
name. We emailed each other a bit. I'm 54. I don't remember anything. Too many pints. Too many English pints.
Yeah, exactly. Far too many English pints, mate. They are that slight little bit bigger than because here in France, you generally have they have the they call it the 33 cl here, the 33, which is between a half and a full pint, and that's the perfect measure, Dom. I'm telling you.
Well, it's the 33. That's another example. That is the old pint,
right? And you're just naturally drawn more to that than and I know our British lads listening to this. Oh, you old bastard! Well, why can't you drink a full pint? Well, it goes warm. Why do you want that?
Yeah, an American pint is a better measure, 16 ounces.
All right, so we've probably made some enemies there for ourselves, mate. Have you ever listened to? I've got a little clip I can show you because I know you'd love it. And I come across Randall Carlson, I think originally on the Netflix show Graham Hancock Show, and now on this podcast. So he's on rediscovering ancient civilizations, and halfway through the interview it's on the Sean Ryan Show. They get into ancient measuring systems, and I'd love to show it to you. So I'll play it here, and I hope this works well for the audio listeners as well. And
okay, great. But did I mention the cube bit was the pyramids, but also the foot was the foundational measure of Stonehenge?
Okay. All right. So he goes back to talking about chain links and ancient measurements. Anyway, you're gonna love it, and then we can perhaps talk about it a little bit more. Let me find it. I had just had it here. Let me put the mic over here. 1 second.
Because my vision is that I would like to take a piece of land and utilize the ancient principles, which starts with things like simple but really cool, like putting a pole in the ground and using that pole to determine the directions and all the alignments. And you don't just build at random. You orient it towards the sky, like they always did. That's a universal principle we find over and over in every continent where we find ancient sacred structures. They're orienting to the movements of the heavens.
Hold on. How do you do that with a pole then? What are you orienting it to?
Well, okay. So first thing you do is you put a pole in the ground, and then you would draw a circle around it. Now, in the old days, they would use a knotted rope or a chain with links, and you could determine the length of the chain by the number of links. And typically, a lot of the chains that came from Europe, the links were carefully manufactured to be 0.792 degrees, which is interesting because then you get certain numbers like 7,920 inches, right? And that gives you some interesting geometric correlations. But anyways.
Like what?
Well, correlations like one of the ancient units of measurement is a furlong. And the only place that I know that a furlong is still used today is in horse racing. It's 1/8 of a mile, 660 feet. Well, if you translate that into inches, it's 7,920 inches. Now, interestingly, if you took the Earth, the Earth is not perfectly spherical. It's rotating. So its mass moves towards the equator. It's called an oblate spheroid, right? So the diameter of the Earth varies by 26 miles. The equator is 26 miles longer than the polar diameter.
No shit. I had no idea.
Yeah. Hey, if it wasn't for that, man, we'd be screwed. the Earth would be wobbling all over the fucking place. Yeah. So you could think of it this way. If you traveled from the equator to the North Pole, you've gone downhill by 13 miles.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that oblateness, it acts like a flywheel that stabilizes the Earth, right? So it goes from equator 7,926 miles, give or take a little bit. Pole 7,900. 26 miles different diameter. So if you go from the center, the geometric center of the Earth out to the surface, you know, the difference is 13 miles between equator and pole. But if you took a perfectly spherical Earth, the diameter of that perfectly spherical Earth that had the same surface area as the actual Earth, it'd be 7,920 miles. Same number of miles as there is inches in a furlong. Now, you could argue, well, that's just a coincidence, of course. I mean, but interestingly.
So it goes on, Dom, and it's tying into like what you were saying about, it all being proportionate to, the divine creator and the human body.
Yeah, well, that's another reason that the metric system is flawed, because the Earth is not perfectly spherical. And so that's why it was doomed from the very start.
So
But
the metric system,
it's so stupid, but they stuck with it. And it's like, when a government gets something wrong, they don't abandon it, they double down. And it's just that. It's that. And like, I'm going to add to what that dude was saying. Yep. There was an English scientist stroke poet. I love the fact that in the 18th, 19th century, you could be a scientist and a poet, or you could be, you weren't just one thing. How today, like, people struggle to get their head around the fact that I'm a comedian and a financial writer. Well, what's the fucking problem? You would, in the old days, you could do 73 different things. But anyway, William Rankin was a scientist and a poet, and he wrote this poem taking the piss out of the French guys who measured the Earth. And his poem went, "A party of astronomers went measuring of the Earth, and 40 million meters they took to be its girth. 500 million inches, though, go through from pole to pole. So let's stick to inches, feet, and yards, and the good old 3-foot rule. And if you measure the circumference of the Earth, it's actually 12 by 12 by 12 by 12 by 12, 12 to the power of 5 English miles. So all these numbers, I don't know if it's coincidence like that guy is saying, but they just do tally.
It's bizarre, mate.
Yeah.
So
it's a process. Let me I'm just trying to find. So in America, in the 70s, they and obviously weights and measures, by the way, have to do with money. Like a pound was once a pound of sterling silver.
I'm coming on to that. Yeah, perfect. I'm glad you're going there. This was the next one.
Okay, because and the word for so many currencies around the world is either like yuan and yen both mean round shape, but livre in French, lira in Italian, they're all weights. Drachma just means a handful, so they're all weights of precious metal. And but I just wanted to quickly, before we go on to money, I just wanted to quickly talk about America, because they tried to impose metric in America. It's so funny. In the 1970s, there was this big thing where they tried to get Americans to adopt it. And there was a thing called the Metric Conversion Act in 1975, which was signed by the president, Gerald Ford. And the Metric Act would make metric the preferred system of weights and measures for United States trade and commerce. But at this point, 50% of Americans still didn't even know what metric was. And so they allowed you to use customary units, as they called them. And there was this real campaign to get it, and there was this resistance to it. And at the head of the resistance to metric was a guy called Dean Crackle, and he went, "Metric is definitely communist." One monetary system, one language, one weight, one measurement system, one world, all communist. And it is part of that. You know, there's this battle now between the sort of, and they're called conspiracy theorists, but they're obviously not. You know, people who are, you know, we're going to one money, one language, one world government, all this stuff. Well, weights and measures are part of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was this big campaign to stop the metric madness in America. And here's a funny story, right? So I used to narrate a lot of documentaries. I still do, actually, but not as many as I used to. And I was once narrating this nature documentary that had this sentence that these larvae travel many kilometers. And so I said this, and the producer goes, no, it's not larvae, it's larvae, and it's not kilometers, it's kilometers. And we got into this big thing, is it kilometers or kilometers? And then the producer goes, no, not the producer, sound engineer's going, no, it's not larvae, it's larvae. It's larvae, it's not larvae, it's not larvae, it's larvae. So we ended up phoning up the BBC pronunciation unit, which is the final word on pronunciation in the UK. And it gives you the guidelines to all the newsreaders and so on. And this woman answered the phone. And what I heard was BBC pronunciation unit. And like the thickest Geordie accent you've ever heard in your life. And they're like, I'm all for, you know, equal opportunities and all the rest of it, but you've got to draw the line somewhere. Anyway, we said we don't know if it's larvae, larvae, or larvae. And she came back with the classic line, I don't know, pet, I don't speak Latin. But and the correct answer, by the way, is actually larvae, with the ver is were, larvae. But because David Attenborough says larvae is acceptable. But then next one, is it kilometer or kilometer? And she came back with the retort, can you not just say mile? Which I'll never forget. But would you say kilometer or kilometer?
Kilometer.
Okay, well, you're absolutely right. And it's a kilometer as in a centimeter or a millimeter. A kilometer as in a mileometer or a speedometer is a different kind of meter. It's a different thing. But when the original the guy did the voiceover in the American ads to promote the metric system, the guy pronounced it wrong in the voiceover, and there was nobody in the session with him to correct him from the metric board. So he pronounced it kilometer instead of kilometer. And so that was on all the air radio stations and all the adverts, and which were much more powerful things in those days because there was much fewer media. And so kilometer became the standard way of saying it. So not only is the measure itself flawed, even the pronunciation of it is flawed as well.
Centralized systems, Dom. What can I say?
Well, exactly. And it's the difference between a system and a process.
Exactly. Which is, you know, money. That leads us perfectly into money, into Bitcoin. Yeah. Let's talk about money. Let's talk about weights and measures of money, and especially in England, because how old were you? Well, do you remember going from, what was it even called? Was it called the imperial system to the decimal system? Because I was talking to my dear old Nan, was 90 last week, and we were there and we were chatting to her, and I was trying to explain to like the kids that, you know, the money that Nan grew up with became worthless in her lifetime. You know, I'm always trying to layer on this idea, you know, of Bitcoin as storing your value and an emergent property becoming the new medium of exchange. And that's what they're going to be using in their lifetime. So your dear old Nan, she grew up with shillings, halfpennies, threepenny bits, and all of this kind of stuff. Do you remember that? And do you remember the change? No. And can you explain to the listeners what happened?
No, it was 1971 and I was 2.
What the fuck happened in 1971, Dom? I
there
mean, do you
go.
think that is I mean, come on. Do you think that's just a wild coincidence?
Well, the previous system, pounds, shillings, and pence, King Offa is credited with designing it, and Offa was king of Mercia in like the 9th century, in the Dark Ages, and he was sort of imported it from Charlemagne, but it's basically the Roman system, Libra, and uh, what's the that's why the pound sign is LB, and even the pound sign is just a sort of graphic that comes from the LB, which would be the Roman Libra, the pound. And the D, they wouldn't call pence P, they would call it D, and that comes from the denarius, the Roman denarius. So it actually comes from Rome, and Rome probably had it off Greece or someone, you know, like all these things. So it's ancient. But Offa is the guy who's credited with designing it, pound, shilling, and pence. And I don't know how to do it because I didn't grow up with it.
Yeah,
and I had it
neither.
explained to me once upon a time, and like everything in this interview, I've gone and forgotten how it works. But when you have it explained, like when you read it, like an old Dickens book or something, it's just like, oh, I don't understand. But actually, when you have it explained, it's actually quite easy and it's totally intuitive. And you know that it works because the Romans have been using it. They used it all through Europe in the Dark Ages. They used it through the Renaissance, and they used it all the way up till 1971. They wouldn't have stopped using it if it hadn't, you know, for thousands of years, if it didn't work and it wasn't intuitive. But yeah, it was all, you know, metal was money, and you defined the value of money was by the weight of the metal, and also whichever metal it was.
And then 1971 rolls around, and everybody in England goes like overnight decimal. And you know, if you speak to your grandparents, that they remember it. Like it didn't make sense. Like to them, it was so confusing. Like everything, the price of everything, you couldn't price anything anymore because you were using a completely different unit of account.
Yeah, and I don't know. I know that when the euro was adopted, loads of people prices just suddenly went up by 2/3, and because everyone just fiddled the system. So there was a sort of tacit inflation as soon as the euro, like in Italy, everyone just ramped their prices up. And I bet something similar happened with decimalization. But decimalization was, you know, it was part of the process. It was partly because they fucked the money because the pound was fucked anyway. One of the many devaluations. You know, the US dollar has lost 93% of its purchasing power since World War II. And the pound, and at World War II, the pound was like 480 to the dollar. And now it's 120. So the US dollar's lost 93%, but the pound has lost another 75% against the US dollar. It's just terrible. But yeah, what the fuck happened in 1971?
Exactly, mate. So time is probably the last thing to talk about here and tie that into Bitcoin. We're redefining, not only are we redefining money, but we're redefining time with the you know, the average block taking every 10 minutes. How have you thought about that with, you know, time going forward? How we're going to account for time, how we're going to account for value against like this flawed metric system, which is clearly a centralized shitcoin?
Yeah, well, the answer is I haven't thought about that. But one thing I've always thought about time is, you know, when you look at a stock chart, a long-term stock chart, and you can either look at an arithmetic chart or you can look at a logarithmic chart. And so a logarithmic chart shows you the percentage gains rather than the nominal gains. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, yeah, but it's worth explaining because this comes up a lot. So if you want to like go into
okay, so on an arithmetic chart, along the bottom you'd have time, and on the is it the y-axis, the vertical axis, you'd have the price. So it would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or whatever the price is. Whereas on a logarithmic chart, and you tend to use logarithmic charts for longer duration stuff, instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the price, it would go 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, like that. So it would show each doubling rather than the actual price gain. And I think that life is on a logarithmic chart, the way we measure time. So if you think when you're a kid, how slowly time goes by. You know, sometimes you're like lying in bed and you can't get to sleep when you're a kid, and you're probably only awake for an hour trying to get to sleep, but it just seems like forever. Or you've got to wait an hour for your mum to do whatever she's got to do, or whatever it is. And just time seems to go by so much slowly, much more slowly. Whereas, you know, when we're 50, an hour just, you don't even notice it, just goes by so quickly. And so my theory is that time is on a logarithmic scale. And so in effect, time accelerates as you get older. I guess what's happening is that, you know, a year when you're 50 is a 50th of your life. Whereas a year when you're 10, you remember how long, you know, I'm 13, I'm 7 years old. Now I'm 7 1/4, I'm 7 1/2, I'm 7 3/4. How slowly a year goes by. Well, when you're 7, a year is 1/7 of your life.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when you're 50, 1/7 of your life is 7 years. 49, 7 7s are 49. So time goes by quicker. And so my theory is that time is on a logarithmic scale. What that has to do with Bitcoin and the blocks and all the rest of it, I do not know. But that's my theory.
So, mate, it's very, very interesting. Very well put. And some bright spark is who's listening to this is going to have some epiphany of, you know, time, and maybe even that that little the 0.792 degrees in chains that, you know, going all the way back to ancient measurement, and here we have a new chain, right? The blockchain or the time chain.
Yeah.
Who
the
knows
link,
how?
the link was a measure.
Yes.
How many links? It was a measure.
Yeah. So that's where my brain is going. When you like visualize, like go to mempool.space, or I've got the other t-shirt on, and you visualize the blockchain and you see it and you're like, yeah, well, it's a chain, and they used to use chains as measurements, and it all ties in somehow. I can't figure it out just yet.
Yeah. And the other thing I think about time is, you know, you might have an hour or half an hour or whatever when you're incredibly productive. And then you might go 24 hours and just do sweet FA. And the value of that 1 hour, or you might, you know, you might go out and meet somebody, and that meeting has, you know, it might be the first time you meet your wife, or it might be somebody who's really helps you in your life in some way. And that meeting might only last 10 minutes, but it has huge consequences to your life. And then you can spend hours and time drifts by and nothing of any consequence happens. So the different periods have different values.
So to end it on a Bitcoin note, Dom, how do you think, you know, those of us that have adopted Bitcoin, it's changed their minds in many different ways, whether it's philosophically, the way we think about, you know, how we're going to orient the rest of our time here on this planet.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think that is? Like,
so my girlfriend, who I sadly split up from now, but she really wanted me to buy a house. She goes, "You got all these Bitcoins. Why don't you just sell your Bitcoins and buy a house?" And I'm like, "I don't want to." Like, you know, she said, "No, you want a house. You can actually enjoy being in. How can you enjoy having the Bitcoins?" And I was like, "I don't know, but I don't want to. I don't want to sell them. You know, I'd love to have a lovely house with you and start a family, blah blah blah." And I'm not saying we don't want a nice house, because everyone wants a nice house, but I don't want to sell my Bitcoins. And she just could not get her head around it, and I found it really difficult to explain. And I was just, I don't want to sell them. And you get that, don't you?
Yes.
And you know, I've made so many mistakes with Bitcoin, and like, you know, when I think that the opportunities, if I played Bitcoin better, what, you know, how rich I could be, and I'm like, I don't want to sell it. And hopefully she got it, but you know, but yeah, I don't know where it's going, but I don't want to sell it.
100%, mate. Well, is there anything else that that you wanted to touch on that we didn't touch on? I think we did all the weights and measures.
Well, what's your, where are you thinking we go in this next cycle? What do you think happens?
Are you talking price predictions here, Dom?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Up.
I'm talking price predictions, but also adoption.
Yeah, I mean that's the real metric we got to look at, right? The number of people that join the network.
Yeah. How quickly after we record this will you put this interview out?
Couple of weeks.
Okay, so we're speaking in on the 10th of May.
Yeah.
And Bitcoin is like $63,000 dollars a coin, something like that. And like, I'm more bearish about sterling than I am about the dollar. And so, you know, and I tell all my readers, I have a Substack called The Flying Frisbee, by the way, and you should all subscribe. But I just tell all my readers, you know, I'm one of these Bitcoin guys. I like gold as well. And I think it's an age thing. When I first went to Bitcoin conferences, you know, in the early part of the last decade, I'd be the oldest guy there. And I go to gold conferences and I'd be the youngest guy there. And I just think this sort of gold Bitcoin war, you know, we're both on the same team.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think it's a generational thing. And old people like gold and young people like Bitcoin. But anyway, I just you just don't want to earn sterling. You just don't want to beyond like a bit more than everyday living expenses. You just don't want to be holding too much in sterling, and even foreign currencies. But so I just don't like sterling at all. But yeah, so I'm interested to hear your Bitcoin price predictions, and like, what's the, you know, another country doing in El Salvador, another corporation putting their treasury in Bitcoin. I'm surprised another corporation hasn't followed Saylor's path yet. We need another trailblazer.
Yeah, we certainly do. Price wise, I mean, well, we've got the next year to find out, right? We've just had the halving, and historically, it takes anywhere between 6 to 9 months after that event for that kind of like supply shock to really show itself in the price of it. Where it's going to go, your guess is as good as mine, mate. Do we sail through 100K? Most likely. Where do we top out? Who knows? Will we have another drawdown? Yes. I mean, why would it be any different this time? Even though the ETFs are buying, even though Saylor's buying, perhaps another trailblazer comes in as well. But you know, it just seems to always follow these cycles. So that's the way I'm looking at it. I'm going to be sat on them and trying to stack as many as I can throughout. And yeah, just hold on to them. Like you were saying, there's not many things in the world that would make you want to part with you know, like the most incredible asset ever discovered in our lifetime.
Yeah, I mean, it's that kind of, I was writing an article about internet anonymity and the need for internet anonymity. And people go, well, why do we need, you know, people are you going on the internet fake, you know, under fake identities, and they're sending horrible racist messages to Ian Wright and Rio Ferdinand or something. You know, we have to stop online anonymity. They're sending horrible messages to politicians. And I'm like, yeah, people abuse the privilege of anonymity, but we need anonymity. Why do we need anonymity? Satoshi Nakamoto, we would not have Bitcoin without internet anonymity.
Yep.
That is reason enough in itself. And they're like, well, Bitcoin, whatever. It's not, they don't get the significance of it. and the implications of it. You know, it's peaceful revolution. It's the first peaceful revolution. And people just don't get that. But, you know, so you have to go, well, you need an anonymity because it enables people to explore new ideas, scientific and artistic and whatever, safety. And if they have to give their own identity, it inhibits them and blah, blah, blah. And you have to make all those arguments. But really, Satoshi Nakamoto. Why do we need internet anonymity? Satoshi Nakamoto. There's your answer.
When you're writing your Substack, do you ever slip in a little bit of Bitcoin, or would you feel...
I write about Bitcoin all the time.
Oh, it is? Okay.
I write about Bitcoin all the time. I love it. And when I write about Bitcoin, the articles do quite well. They get quite a few hits. Yeah.
Because I was wondering whether like your audience would be more macro kind of focused, more like stocks and shares, gold, currencies.
Yeah, I write about all of that.
Yeah.
And people, but you know, my Bitcoin book was published in 2014, and you know, it orange pilled a lot of people, that book. That was how they discovered Bitcoin, or reading articles I'd written in Money Week. You know, I'm responsible for getting a lot of people into Bitcoin in the UK, at least. And you know, I've made a lot of people a lot of money as a result of that. And you know, I get messages all the time thanking me. And, you know, it didn't have the reach of Safedeen's book because he got the distribution in America, which I didn't get. And he's better at marketing than me. But, you know, I've still orange pilled a lot of people. And a lot of those people who are orange pilled read my Substack.
Good, mate. Good. And your stand-up shows as well. You're dropping it in there?
I've got a few Bitcoin jokes in my stand-up. I've got to write a Bitcoin song. Are you too young to remember a TV show called Swap Shop?
I can't picture it. I knew it existed, but yeah, I don't remember it.
So I want to use the Swap Shop music would lend itself really well to a Bitcoin song. I've got to do that. And yeah, what the Bitcoin joke I do is you could have bought Bitcoin 10 years ago and you could sell it today and you still wouldn't be able to explain how it works.
So true, mate. So true.
Yeah.
Here we are.
Then I say
to
Bitcoin
explain.
is like the House of Lords. Everyone knows it's expensive, but nobody knows how it works.
Right. There are no experts, mate, in Bitcoin.
There are no
experts.
Sure. But I do
many.
think I love Michael Saylor. I think he's a genius. And in fact, I said this to him at his house. But Bitcoin needs a new cheerleader. It needs, like Roger Ver was a brilliant Bitcoin Jesus and Michael Saylor was a brilliant Bitcoin Jesus, but we need a new Jesus.
Yep.
I don't know who that guy is. Maybe it's me.
Bring it on, Dom.
It's not me, but it needs a new one. That's for sure.
All right, mate. Well, you said you wanted to be done by 11 your time. We're 5 past, so I'll let you go. Thank you. Thanks, for coming
Daniel,
on, mate.
for the opportunity, and stick a link to my Substack in somewhere in the description or something.
Yeah, 100%. I'll put in the link there and to your website or anything. Any links you want me to link to, then just ping it over on DM and I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah. It's theflyingfrisbee.com.
Flyingfrisbee.com. Excellent. Yeah. Cheers, Dom. Oh, cheers. Last question. Are you going to be at any conferences?
Oh, man, I was so angry with I'm so lazy about conferences. But I didn't go to that one in Madeira.
Oh, yes.
And somebody was going, come to this one. And I remember being on Friday night, watching some of it on the internet and thinking, what the fuck am I doing? I'm on my own in my house. Why have I not gone to Madeira? I was so angry with myself. But yeah, I'm going to go to a couple. I've got quite a busy 6 months, but I'm going to go to a couple. Yeah.
Are you going to be in
Not
Prague?
sure which ones yet. Yeah, I might go to Prague. When is Prague?
Middle of June.
Is it the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th? That one?
Yeah.
I can't go that one. No, I can't go that one.
Damn.
Unfortunately. But I'll go to another one.
All right, cool. Well, I'll bump into you at one of these conferences, mate. And yeah, thanks for coming on. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.
See you.